The morning Susan Barrett found a cord of freshly split firewood stacked against her barn wall. She stood in the cold October air of 1882 and felt something crack open inside her chest that she had worked for 2 long years to keep firmly sealed. She stared at that wood for a long time. The splits were clean and even, the kind of work a strong and practiced arm made easy, and they were stacked with a precision that told her whoever had done it understood the value of keeping water off a stack. There were enough logs there to carry her through the worst of a Montana winter, and she had not asked for a single one of them. She looked up and down the long dirt road that ran in front of her property. The morning was still gray, the sun barely touching the peaks of the Bitterroot Range to the west, and there was nobody to be seen. Just the empty road and the cold and the creak of her barn door in the wind. Susan Barrett was 41 years old, and she had been alone on this 30-acre ranch outside the town of Millhaven since her husband Robert had died of a fever in the autumn of 1880. She had 2 daughters, Clara, who was 16, and Nora, who was 13, and together the 3 of them had kept the ranch running through force of will and stubbornness, and the kind of exhaustion that a person stops noticing after a while because it simply becomes the texture of each day. The town of Millhaven, population perhaps 300 souls, had not been unkind to her. But Millhaven had a way of offering its kindness like a test, watching to see whether Susan would accept it, and therefore agree to some unspoken arrangement about her place in the social order of things. The older women of the church auxiliary had brought her pies and casseroles, and had looked at her land with the bright, calculating eyes of women who knew what 30 acres unworked by a man was worth. The men had offered to buy her out, sometimes with gentleness, and sometimes with a casual bluntness that made clear they expected her to cave eventually. A widow with 2 girls and a ranch she could barely manage was, in their estimation, an inevitability waiting to happen. Susan had not caved. She had thanked them for the pies and sent them home. She had refused every offer on the land. She had learned to mend her own fencing and doctor her own livestock and haul her own water when the pump gave trouble, and she had done all of it with a straight back and a level gaze, and the kind of quiet refusal that the town of Millhaven eventually stopped being charmed by and started calling pride. They said she was proud. They said it the way people say it when they mean something else, when they mean you are inconvenient to us, and we wish you would simply admit defeat. Old Widow Barrett, too proud to take a neighbor's help, too proud to sell, too proud to come to the socials and smile at the men who were looking her over. Too proud by half, the women in front of Hendrick's dry goods store would say, shaking their heads with a sympathy that had teeth in it. Susan did not particularly care what they said. She had learned to not care, the way you learn to walk on a bad knee, adjusting your weight without thinking about it. But the firewood was something else entirely. The firewood had appeared without a witness, without a request, and without any of the social machinery that made help in Millhaven feel like a transaction. It was just there. And it was exactly what she needed, because the night before she had stood in her barn looking at her diminished pile and felt the first real cold finger of worry touch the back of her neck. She brought her daughters out to look at it after breakfast. Clara crossed her arms and looked up and down the road the same way her mother had. "Who did this?" she asked. "I don't know," Susan said. "Someone from town," Nora said, already practical in the way youngest children sometimes are. "Someone who knew we were running low." "Nobody from town knows we were running low," Clara said. "Mother hasn't told a soul." Susan turned and went back inside. She set a kettle on the iron stove and stood there with her hands wrapped around her elbows, thinking. There was a man who had come to Millhaven about 6 weeks ago, a man who had taken the small room above the livery stable and had begun doing odd work around the town and its outskirts. Harlan Dalton. She knew his name because everyone in Millhaven knew his name, the way everyone always knew the name of a stranger who stayed longer than a few days. He was perhaps 38 or so, tall and lean with the sun-darkened look of a man who had spent his life outdoors, and he had a quality of quietness about him that people in Millhaven either found reassuring or deeply suspicious depending on their nature. She had seen him twice. Once in the street outside Hendricks, where he had tipped his hat to her with a courtesy that was not performance, just a simple acknowledgement. And once at the hardware store, where they had stood at the same counter, and he had moved aside to let her reach the bolt she needed, and had not made a production of the gesture. She did not know him. She did not know what he wanted in Millhaven or where he had come from, and she told herself firmly that she could not assume he was the one who had left the wood. It could have been anyone. It could have been old Bert Hennessy 3 farms over, who had always been quietly decent without making a fuss about it. She put the matter aside and went to work, because there was always work to be done. The second time it happened was 10 days later. She came out in the early morning to find that the gap in her eastern fence line, the one she had been meaning to repair for 3 weeks but had not had the hours for, had been repaired. The posts were set straight and the wire was strung tight, and the work was solid enough that she had to look closely to find where the old line ended and the new repair began. She stood there in the frost-killed grass and felt that cracking sensation again, the one she did not want to feel, the one that reminded her she was tired. She was so deeply tired of doing everything alone, and she had made a private treaty with that tiredness that said she would not acknowledge it because acknowledging it would make it larger. The firewood had already strained that treaty. The fence repair snapped it clean through. She went to Clara. "Have you said anything to anyone in town about what needs doing around here?" Clara was offended. "Of course not, Mother." Susan believed her. Clara had inherited her mother's iron sense of privacy. She went to Nora. Nora looked up from the table where she was working at her schoolwork and her expression shifted, the slight transparency of a child who is keeping something. "Nora," Susan said. "I did not say anything to anyone in town," Nora said carefully. "That is a very specific thing to say." Nora set down her pencil. She was 13 and she was honest, which meant she had a limited capacity for evasion under direct questioning. "I was at the creek last week getting water because the pump was slow, and Mr. Dalton was riding past on the road and he stopped to say good morning. He was very polite, Mother, and I might have mentioned that you had been meaning to fix the fence but you were having trouble finding the time." Susan stood very still. "He did not say he would do anything," Nora added quickly. "He just listened. He did not make me feel like I was telling tales. He just seemed interested." "Interested?" Susan repeated. "In a kind way," Nora said, with the particular confidence of 13-year-olds who believe they are excellent judges of character. Susan sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her and thought about Harlan Dalton for a great deal longer than she intended to. She thought about how she could not go to him and thank him, because thanking him would mean admitting she knew it was him, and admitting she knew it was him would open a door she was not prepared to open. She thought about how she could not tell him to stop, because she did not technically know that he was doing anything. She thought about how the wood and the fence had both appeared at times when she had gone to bed genuinely worried about something, as if someone had read the worry directly off her face. She had not talked to anyone about her worries. She did not do that, but evidently she did not need to, because Nora was 13 and she talked to the world the way her mother no longer allowed herself to. The third time it happened, Susan was actually awake to see the beginning of it. She could not sleep. It was sometime in the middle of November, and a cold snap had come down from the mountains, and she lay in her bed listening to the wind and thinking about the water pipes that ran from the well to the house, which had a tendency to freeze in hard cold. She had wrapped them with burlap in October, but the burlap was thin, and she knew it might not be enough. She got up before first light and put on her coat over her nightgown and went outside to check, and that was when she saw the lantern moving near the well. Her heart lurched first with fear, and then with something else when the figure holding the lantern straightened up and she saw, even in the darkness, the particular height and the particular way he held his shoulders. Harlan Dalton. He was crouched at the base of the well housing with what looked like a thick roll of canvas and a length of rope, doing the pipe insulation that she had been planning to do properly come the weekend. He had not seen her. The lantern cast its circle of light, and he worked inside it with his back to the house, his breath making small white clouds in the freezing air. Susan stood on her porch in her coat and her nightgown and her unlaced boots, and watched him for a moment that stretched out in the dark and the cold until it was long enough to be something she would remember later. She should have said something. She almost did once, and then found that she did not know what to say. She was not accustomed to not knowing what to say. She watched him finish with the canvas, test the wrapping with his hands, stand and pick up the lantern, and begin walking quietly back toward the road. He was almost to the fence when he saw her. He stopped. The lantern light reached her at that distance, but only faintly, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the dead grass and the cold air. She could see that he had not expected to be seen. There was a stillness in him that was not guilt exactly, but something more like a person who has been caught at something private. Susan said nothing. Harlan Dalton said nothing either. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a single quiet gesture, and continued walking to the road, and was gone. Susan stood on her porch for a long time after his footsteps faded. The cold came up through the soles of her boots, and she did not go inside. She stood there looking at the place in the darkness where he had been. She was not a woman who had spent the past 2 years romanticizing things. She was practical and direct, and she had buried a husband and raised 2 daughters and run a ranch, and she did not have the luxury of romanticizing anything. But she stood on that porch in the November cold and felt something move in her that she had believed for 2 years was dead, and she could not entirely decide whether to be glad of it or terrified. She chose, for the time being, to be neither. She went inside and made coffee and waited for the sun. The next Saturday, Susan went to Millhaven to collect her mail and buy flour and the small household things that needed replenishing, and she told herself that the fact that she had put on her good dark green wool dress was a coincidence, or at most a simple matter of self-respect. She was at the counter of Hendrick's Dry Goods when Harlan Dalton came in through the door. She felt him before she heard him, which was a thing she did not admit to herself until much later. She heard the bell above the door and then a shift in the air of the room, and then she was aware of him standing near the door looking at the shelves as though he was deciding something. Old Edgar Hendricks called out a greeting and Harlan answered in his low voice and moved to the counter to put in a small order for coffee and beans, and the kind of simple supplies a man living alone required. He was perhaps 2 feet from her at that point, and Susan concentrated very hard on the list she was holding. "Mrs. Barrett," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with a directness that was not rude, just unguarded. His eyes were gray-brown, the color of creek water over flat rocks, and they had a quality of attentiveness that made her feel, for a disturbing moment, like she was being read. "Mr. Dalton," she said. There was a pause in which Edgar Hendricks found something requiring his attention at the other end of the counter. "I hope the cold snap has not been too hard on your property," Harlan said. "We have managed," Susan said, and then because she was not a coward, she added, "The pipes did not freeze." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the way weather moves across a landscape before you can name it. "That is good to hear," he said. "Yes," Susan said. "It is." Another pause. She was aware that she was holding her list with both hands and that her knuckles were slightly too white. "I have been meaning to ask," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, "whether you have any ongoing work here in Millhaven or whether you are passing through." It was not the question she had meant to ask. She had meant to ask nothing. The question had simply come out of her of its own accord, like water finding a crack. "I have been finding enough to keep me busy," he said. "The area suits me well enough." "You are from further south." She was aware this was a conversation now. She had not planned to have a conversation. "Texas originally. I have been moving around some years." He said it without apology or embellishment, the way people state facts that are simply the shape of their lives. Millhaven is a long way from Texas, she said. It is, he agreed. I find I don't mind the distance. Edgar came back with her flour, and the conversation was interrupted in the way that conversations in general stores are always interrupted, by the ordinary commerce of goods changing hands and coins counted out. Harlan stepped back to give her room, and when she turned with her parcels, he reached over and opened the door for her in a gesture that was simply automatic, the reflex of a man who had been raised with certain habits. She went out into the cold air of the Millhaven street. She walked to her wagon and loaded her things and sat for a moment with the reins in her hands, looking at the horse's ears. She had not thanked him. Not for the wood, not for the fence, not for the pipes. She had not thanked him because she still had not technically acknowledged that she knew. And she had not acknowledged it because something in her was afraid of what came after acknowledgement, afraid of the door that would open and all the cold air that might come through it. She drove home and did not look back at the door of Hendricks. Clara noticed her mood at dinner that evening, the way Clara noticed everything. She was 16 and she had her mother's perception turned up to a slightly painful volume. "You seem unsettled," Clara said. "I am fine," Susan said. "You only cut the carrots that small when you are working through something." Susan looked down at the very small carrot pieces in the stew. She pushed them around with her spoon. "I spoke to Mr. Dalton in town today," she said. Nora looked up from her bowl with an expression of elaborate unconcern that she had clearly been preparing since Susan came home. "Did you?" she said. "Yes," Susan said. "He seems like a decent man." "He is," Nora said, all pretense of unconcern abandoned in an instant. "I think he is very decent. He listens properly when you talk to him, not just waiting for you to stop like most people do." Clara was still watching her mother. Clara said nothing, which was louder than anything Nora was saying. "Eat your supper," Susan said to both of them. The following week Harlan Dalton knocked on her front door in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She had been at the kitchen table going over what she grandly called her accounts, which were a series of numbers in a small ledger that did not add up to anything comforting. She heard the knock and went to the door and opened it and found him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and an expression that was not quite uncertain but was close enough to uncertain that it made her chest do something inconvenient. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, "I apologize for coming without notice. I will understand if you want me to go." "What do you want, Mr. Dalton?" she said. He looked at her directly, the same way he had in the store. "I have been leaving help on your property without your knowledge or consent," he said. "That was not right of me. I should have asked. I want to ask properly now." The straightforwardness of it disarmed her completely. She had prepared in the past week for any number of possible versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for simple honesty. "Come in," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. He came inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen with his hat in his hands, looking at the room with the quiet observance of a person who is in someone else's space and knows it. The kitchen was clean but spare, and the ledger was open on the table, and she did not close it, because closing it would have felt like hiding something, and she did not hide things in her own house. She gestured to the chair across the table, and he sat down and she put coffee on, because it was what you did. "You have been running this place alone since your husband passed," he said. 2 years, she said. "I have been running it alone 2 years." "You do a good job of it," he said. "I do what needs doing," she said, which was how she always answered that observation. But she was watching him when she said it, and she saw that he accepted the answer without feeling the need to argue with it or soften it or make it smaller, and that small thing lodged itself somewhere in her ribcage. "I have been working around this area," he said, "and I pass by your property regular. I notice things." He paused. "I did not mean to be presumptuous." "Were you watching my property specifically?" she asked. "At first I was just passing," he said, "but then I started watching for how you were managing. I told myself it was just neighborly interest." He looked at the hat in his hands. "I think I knew after a while that it was more than that, but I did not know what to do with that knowing, so I just did what I could see needed doing." Susan sat down across from him with her coffee. She looked at the ledger and then at him. "The town thinks I am proud," she said. "I know what the town thinks," he said. "And you did it the way you did it so I would not have to fight being helped," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The coffee was hot in her hands and the kitchen was warm, and outside the wind was doing something persistent against the windows. "That is either very thoughtful," she said slowly, "or very presumptuous." "Probably both," he said. She almost smiled. She could feel it at the edge of her mouth and she did not quite let it out. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care about the state of my farm and my pipes and my fence?" He held her gaze and did not look away from it, which she had learned in 2 years of widowhood to consider unusual in a man who was being asked something direct. "Because I have been traveling a long time," he said, "and I am tired of traveling. And when I came to Millhaven I saw you in the street and I thought, there is a woman who knows exactly who she is, and that is a rare thing." The almost smile reached the surface. She could not hold it back. It was small and it was quick, but it was real, and she saw him see it, and something in his eyes changed, a warmth coming into them like a lamp being turned up. "I need to think about this," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not a woman who moves fast," she said. "I can see that," he said, without any frustration in it. "And I have daughters," she said. "Anything that happens in this house happens in front of my daughters and affects them." "I understand that completely," he said. She drank her coffee and he drank his, and the wind kept at the windows and the stove ticked with heat, and it was the most oddly comfortable silence she had sat in since Robert had died. She did not examine this too closely. She just sat in it for a moment and let it be. "You can come by on a Sunday," she said at last. "Sunday afternoons, if you would like, properly and with my knowledge." The warmth in his eyes became something quieter and deeper, something that was not excitement exactly, but was perhaps the relief of a man who has been hoping for a very specific thing, and has just been told the door is not locked. "I would like that very much," he said. He left shortly after, putting on his hat in the doorway and stepping out into the gray afternoon, and Susan stood at the kitchen window and watched him walk to the road. Clara appeared at her shoulder. "The man who left the wood and fixed the fence," Clara said. "Yes," Susan said. "I see," Clara said, and then, after a moment, "He is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would make a noise about it," Clara said. "A man who does things quietly is more interesting." Nora burst in from the back door at that moment, boots trailing mud, with a dead rabbit she had caught in a trap that needed dealing with, and the moment ended in the ordinary business of the ranch and the girls and the evening, and Susan moved through it all with a small warmth settled in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. He came the following Sunday. He came with his hat and without pretension, and Susan had made a cake. Not because she was making an occasion of it, but because she had made a cake, she told herself, and the timing was coincidental. Clara was not fooled by this reasoning and had the good grace not to say so. He sat in the front room with his hat on his knee, and Nora interrogated him with the frank curiosity of a 13-year-old who has decided she approves of something and wants to confirm her approval with data. He answered her questions without condescension, and without the false warmth that adults sometimes perform for children, and Susan watched from the kitchen doorway while she cut the cake and felt something she recognized as gratitude, a deep and specific gratitude that had nothing to do with firewood. She learned things about him that afternoon. He was from a small town outside San Antonio. His father had been a rancher and had taught him everything about cattle and fence lines and the kind of work that land demands. He had been in the army briefly, cavalry, and had seen things he did not speak about specifically, but that lived behind his eyes in the particular way that war lived in certain men, quiet and permanent. He had drifted north after that, working ranches through Colorado and Wyoming before arriving in Montana. He did not mention a wife. She noted the absence of the mention the way she noted the absence of his ring, which was to say carefully, and without making it a thing. After the cake, Clara took Nora to do the evening chores, and Susan and Harlan sat in the front room with the lamp burning and talked. They talked about the land and the winters, and the way Montana could be brutal in a way that was also beautiful if you could see past the brutality. They talked about the town of Millhaven and the people in it, not unkindly, just with the honest assessment of people who are outside a community even while being part of it. She talked about Robert. She had not planned to, but it came out naturally, the way things come out when you are talking to someone who is actually listening. He was a good man, she said. Quiet, the way this land requires. He loved this ranch more than anything. It is why I have not sold it. It feels like it would be a betrayal. It would not be a betrayal, Harlan said, but I can understand why it feels that way. Why would it not be, she asked. Because he would want you to survive, Harlan said simply. Good men generally want that for the people they leave behind. She looked at the lamp. You sound like you know something about leaving, she said. I left people, he said, not because I stopped caring. There are things that make leaving feel like the only option even when it is not what you want. She did not press it. He would tell her in time or he would not, and it was not her place to extract it. She had learned that patience was not passivity. He left at the end of the evening with the same quiet courtesy that seemed to be simply how he moved through the world, and she watched from the door until the sound of his horse faded. And then she stood in her own doorway for a moment with the cold coming in, and looked at her ranch in the dark, and felt a fundamental shift in something, as if the axis of a thing had moved a few degrees, and the world looked the same, but the light fell slightly differently. The Sundays became a pattern, and then the pattern became the week's natural destination, the day she found herself orienting toward without making a decision to do so. He came and he sat in her front room, and they talked, and gradually the conversations deepened and widened the way rivers do when they reach flat ground, spreading into territories she had not expected. He knew about books, which surprised her. He had a whole box of them in his room above the livery, and he brought her one once, a novel that she read in 3 evenings and that she had to admit was excellent, and that made him look at her with that quiet warmth when she said so, as if her opinion was specifically the one he valued. He began doing small things in the ordinary daylight hours with her knowledge. Not imposing himself but offering, and she found that offering was different from the hidden nighttime work, or rather that the hidden nighttime work had been a kind of preamble, a way of establishing that the help came with nothing attached that she did not choose to accept. He repaired the hinge on the barn door one Sunday afternoon while she was mending nearby, and they talked while he worked, and she realized this was a thing she had missed without consciously knowing it, the simple company of a capable person working alongside her. Clara watched all of this with her mother's own perceptiveness turned up to its highest setting, and said very little about it, which meant she was thinking a great deal. Nora was openly delighted and entirely without subtlety about being openly delighted, and had begun referring to Harlan in conversation as though he were already a fixed feature of their lives, which sometimes made Susan catch her breath. But she was cautious. She was 41 years old, and she had been self-sufficient for 2 years by hard necessity, and she was not going to rush herself or allow herself to be rushed. She observed him. She noticed how he was with her daughters, never overstepping, never presuming, treating Clara with respect and Nora with warmth, but neither of them with an ownership he had not earned. She noticed how he was with the horses, which she had always believed told you something true about a person. She noticed how he talked about other people, the other ranchers and the people of Millhaven, with a fairness that was not naive, a willingness to see complexity without either sentimentalizing or condemning. He told her in December about his first wife. They were sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the stove warm and the snow coming down outside in the particular thick, quiet way of Montana December snow, and he said it plainly and without preamble, the way she was coming to understand he said difficult things. I was married before, he said. Her name was Alice. She died in 1876, fever like your husband. It was a bad year for fever. I am sorry, Susan said. "We had 2 years," he said. "She was a good woman. After she died, I could not stay in one place. I think I knew somewhere that staying still meant having to feel it, and I was not ready to feel it for a long time." "And now," Susan said. He looked across the table at her. "Now I am staying still," he said. "I think I am ready." The snow fell outside and the stove ticked, and Susan felt the understanding of loss move between them like a living thing, the specific understanding of people who have both carried grief and who know its weight and texture, and the way it eventually changes shape without ever going away entirely. She did not say anything about this, but she thought it communicated itself anyway, because that was how things communicated themselves with Harlan Dalton, without requiring words. She reached across the table and put her hand over his hand, just for a moment. Then she took it back and they returned to the conversation, and neither of them remarked on it, but afterward she could still feel the warmth of his hand beneath her palm. Milhaven noticed, of course. Milhaven noticed everything. The fact that Harlan Dalton was at the Barrett ranch on Sundays, the fact that he was seen in her company in the street more than once, the fact that he had apparently taken it upon himself to do work on her property, all of this traveled through the town's network of observation and comment with the efficiency of a telegraph wire. Susan was aware of the noticing. She had spent 2 years being noticed by Milhaven, and she was not interested in adjusting her behavior to manage its commentary. Some of the commentary was benevolent, the tentatively approving murmuring of people who had watched Susan Barrett carry her load alone for 2 years, and who were genuinely pleased to see her having some relief from it. Some of it was less benevolent, the brittle interest of women who had decided Susan's pride was offensive, and who found it somewhat satisfying that she had apparently overcome it by way of a drifting stranger with no visible property or standing. And some of it was simply the reflexive suspicion of a small town, presented with an unfamiliar quantity in the form of Harlan Dalton, about whom not very much was known. This last variety came to a head one afternoon in January when Susan was in Hendricks, and Mavis Coburn, wife of the bank's head teller, positioned herself between Susan and the door and said, with the particular smile of a woman who believes she is being helpful, "We all think it is wonderful that you have found a companion, Susan. Truly we do. Though I expect no one knows much about where he comes from or what he was before." Susan looked at Mavis Coburn for a moment with the expression that had made 2 years' worth of offers on her land collapse into embarrassed retreats. "I know what matters," she said. "Good afternoon, Mavis." She told Harlan about it that Sunday and expected him to be offended or troubled. Instead, he looked thoughtful. "She is not entirely wrong," he said. "You know things about me because I have told them to you. The town does not know those things." "Does it need to?" Susan asked. "For your sake it might help," he said. "You live in this town. Your daughters live in this town. I do not want to be a complication for you." She found this deeply irritating, not because it was wrong, but because it was so transparently him setting aside his own interests to account for hers, and she had not had anyone do that for her in a long time, and it made her want to be contrary about it. "You are not a complication," she said firmly. He smiled at that. He smiled properly this time, not the suggestion of a smile but the full expression, and it did something fairly significant to her heartbeat. She looked away and attended to the coffee pot with more concentration than it required. Clara and Nora were both at the table that afternoon and both witnessed this exchange, and Clara immediately became very interested in her book, and Nora immediately became very interested in not showing how interested she was in everything, and the kitchen was full of a suppressed liveliness that Susan chose to pretend she did not notice. In February, one of Susan's horses, a bay mare named Persimmon who was 8 years old and as necessary to the running of the ranch as water, got into something in the lower field and came up lame. The lameness was not catastrophic, but it was serious enough that Susan lay awake 2 nights in a row running numbers in her head and arriving at a conclusion that was not encouraging. A lame horse in February on a working ranch was a genuine problem. Harlan came on Sunday and saw the mare in the paddock and asked about it, and she told him, and he went and looked at the leg with the careful hands of a man who had grown up around horses. "It is not the joint," he said. "It is the soft tissue. With the right treatment and rest she will come back sound." "I know that," Susan said. "The problem is the rest. I need that horse." "What do you need her for in the next few weeks?" he asked. She told him, thinking through the things she needed to transport and the work she needed the horse for, and he listened and then said, "My horse can cover most of that if you need. I am not using him every day." She started to refuse. It was reflex by this point, the 2-year reflex of not accepting help, and she could feel it rising in her throat like a practiced speech. She stopped it. She looked at him standing by the paddock fence in the February cold with his hat pulled down against the wind, and she thought about pride and about what pride was actually for, whether it was a shield she needed or a wall she had built so high she could no longer see over it. "Thank you," she said. "I would be grateful for the use of your horse." It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. She saw him understand that it felt enormous, saw it in the quiet steadiness of his expression, and he did not make it more than it was. He just nodded. "I will bring him over Monday morning," he said. He did, and the weeks that Persimmon rested were weeks during which Harlan found himself at the Barrett ranch with more frequency, and for more practical reasons. And Susan found that she had stopped feeling ambivalent about this. The ambivalence had been, she understood now, a product of fear, the specific fear of someone who has been hurt by loss and who recognizes that the more you let someone matter, the larger the potential hole they can leave. She knew this about herself. She had known it since Robert died. The knowledge did not make the fear less present, but it made it possible to act despite it. She let him matter. Incrementally, carefully, with the full deliberateness of a woman who makes choices rather than falling into them. She let him become important to her daily life. Not in a way that erased the self-sufficiency she had built, not as a replacement for her own competence, but as an addition to it, an extra room in a house that had been functional before but was warmer with the addition. The night Persimmon was declared sound, 3 weeks into March, Susan came out of the barn from checking on the mare and found Harlan sitting on the paddock fence in the dark looking at the stars, which were extraordinary over Montana in March, and she stood next to him and they both looked up at them for a while. "She is going to be fine," Susan said. "I know," he said. He had come by to check on the horse in the evening as he had been doing, a habit that had settled itself into the routine without anyone remarking on it. "I want to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said. She kept looking at the stars. "I have been thinking about what you said in December, about being ready to stay still." She paused. "I have been thinking about whether I am ready, whether I can." She stopped. She was not accustomed to having difficulty with words, but she was having difficulty now. "Whether I can risk something again." He turned on the fence to look at her and she turned to look at him, and the starlight was the particular silver blue of Montana nights in March, and she could see his face clearly enough, the steadiness of it, the watchfulness. "I am not asking you to decide anything," he said. "I know you are not," she said. "That is partly why I want to." He waited. "I am frightened," she said. She said it plainly, the way she knew he understood plainness. "I want to say that clearly because I think it is important you know it. I am frightened of what this is becoming, and I am also—" She stopped again. She looked at the stars and then back at him. "I am also more glad about it than I have been glad about anything in 2 years." He got down from the fence and stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold air, and he looked at her in the way he looked at things that required his full attention, which was to say completely. "Susan," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it all the way down through her boots. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I am not going to go anywhere. I want you to know that before anything else. Whatever you decide about what this is, I am not going anywhere." She reached up and touched his face. Just her hand against his jaw, the simple human gesture of contact, and he stilled completely under it. She felt him breathe. She felt the rough of his jaw against her palm and the warmth of his skin, and 2 years of keeping herself closed and held together broke open not violently but quietly, the way ice breaks in spring, a slow, certain separation that is not destruction but transformation. She kissed him. It was her decision entirely, a full and considered and deliberate decision, and it was also the most natural thing she had done in a very long time, as natural as water finding the low ground, as natural as April following March. When they separated, she was looking up at him, and he was looking at her, and there was so much in his expression that she did not try to catalog it, just stood in the middle of it. "Good," she said, which was perhaps not the most romantic thing ever said in Montana in March under a field of stars, but it was honest, and it made him laugh, a real laugh, low and warm, and that was the first time she had heard him laugh like that, and she stored it like firewood, like something valuable against the cold. The spring of 1883 was remarkable on the Barrett ranch. It was remarkable for the practical reasons, the way a spring is always remarkable after a hard winter, but also because something fundamental in the atmosphere of the place had shifted, as though the land itself had registered a change. Susan worked her fields with an energy she recognized from years earlier, before grief and exhaustion had worn grooves into her days, and the difference was not only about Harlan. It was about what she had recovered in herself through the process of trusting again, the particular liveliness that comes from allowing yourself to want things. He was there often now. He had begun working the Barrett ranch alongside his other work, mornings and evenings. And while this was practical and necessary, in the sense that the ranch genuinely required more hands as spring brought its multiplying demands, it was also more than practical, and everyone knew it. Clara had given a single, significant nod when she understood the change in the situation, and had thereafter simply treated Harlan as present, incorporating him into the ranch's daily functioning with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has decided a thing is settled. Nora had cried, which she explained was from happiness, and then had demanded to know when he was going to move in properly, which had made Susan send her to see to the chickens with more firmness than the situation perhaps strictly required. Harlan did not move in until they were married, because Susan would not have it otherwise, and because the integrity of that position mattered to her and to her daughters, and because Harlan respected it without her needing to explain it. He did, however, have what Nora called a permanent presence, which consisted of his horse in the barn and his tools in the shed and his coffee cup on the shelf above the stove, and that was enough for the time being. He asked her to marry him in April. He did not make a production of it. He asked her on a Tuesday morning, a work day, while they were mending the south fence together, which was so perfectly him that it made her chest ache with affection. They were both in their work clothes, and her hair was in a practical braid, and they had been talking about the east field and whether to try alfalfa this year, and he stopped in the middle of the conversation and said, "Susan, will you marry me?" She looked at him over the fence wire. "It is not a question," she said, noting the absence of an inflection. "No," he said, "it is not. But I am aware that you prefer to make decisions, so I am also making it a question. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had left her firewood in the dark and fixed her fence under a cold sky, and wrapped her pipes in canvas in the middle of the night, and brought her books and listened to her daughters, and had the courtesy to understand that help given without being asked for was only generous when it was given in a way that left the recipient's dignity intact. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed to her side of the fence and kissed her with the wire still between them, and she put her free hand against his chest and felt his heart going in there, strong and steady, and thought about how she had spent 2 years building walls against this exact sensation, and about how thoroughly and completely wrong she had been about those walls. They were married in June. The ceremony was simple because Susan wanted it simple. It was held in the small church on the east side of Millhaven, in front of perhaps 60 people, and the Reverend Hayes performed it with the slightly surprised benevolence of a man who had expected Susan Barrett to be alone for a great deal longer, and was now cheerfully revising his estimation of things. Clara stood with her mother, and Nora stood with her mother, and Harlan had no family present, which was a thing that Susan had thought about privately with a quiet tenderness. And when she took his hands at the altar and looked at his face, she saw something there that was more than the occasion, something that was resolution, the specific resolution of a man who had been traveling a long time and had finally, absolutely stopped. "I do," he said, when the moment came, and Susan had heard those words spoken once before in her life and thought she knew what they meant. But this time, at 41, in a small church in Montana with 60 people she had known for years watching her and her daughters beside her and the summer light coming through the plain glass windows, she discovered they contained more than she had previously understood. More willingness, more courage, more choice. "I do," she said. They rode home together in the wagon, the four of them, and when they came around the last curve of the road and the ranch came into view, Harlan was quiet for a moment looking at it. "My home," he said. He said it with a simplicity that was entirely without sentimentality and entirely full of meaning, and Susan sat beside him and felt the word land, felt it settle into the land around them like a thing that had always been true and had simply been waiting to be spoken. The summer was full and good. Harlan proved himself in the ways that mattered, in work and in judgment, and in the patient building of a life, alongside rather than over or beneath. He had opinions about the ranch and he shared them plainly, and he listened to Susan's answers with the same attention he gave to everything she said, and they disagreed sometimes, directly and without drama, and they resolved disagreements the way adults who respect each other resolve them, through conversation and compromise and an occasional principled yielding. He was good at yielding, better than most men she had known, and she told him so once, and he said, "I had to learn that. I was not always." She believed him. She could see the discipline in it, the deliberate quality of a person who has examined his own defaults and chosen to change them. He was good with Clara in the way that mattered most, which was that he did not try to be her father. He was present and consistent and fair, and he gave her opinions respect, and he did not attempt to fill the space that Robert had occupied, which was the right instinct, and which Clara recognized and responded to with a slow but genuine warmth. By midsummer they had a rapport that was something like friendship, practical and direct, and Susan sometimes watched them talking over some piece of ranch business, and felt a particular happiness that was quiet and deep. Nora, who had been delighted from the beginning, bloomed under his straightforward affection, the way a plant blooms under reliable water, not dramatically but steadily and thoroughly. He helped her with her arithmetic without making her feel stupid, which was apparently something of a gift, and she reported to her mother with great satisfaction that he was the only person who had ever explained long division in a way that made sense. "High praise," Harlan said, when Susan told him. "For Nora, yes," Susan said. "She has strong opinions about arithmetic instruction." Summer moved toward fall, and fall came with the particular blue and gold magnificence that Montana produced, as if apologizing for what winter was about to do, and the Barrett Ranch, now the Dalton Ranch, operated with a new efficiency and a new ease. The firewood was cut in good time and stacked properly and covered, a sight that made Susan smile privately every time she looked at it. The fences were sound. The horses were sound. The accounts, which Harlan had looked at once and set about addressing with calm, practical intelligence, were beginning to look less alarming. It was in October that she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday, the same kitchen where so much had already happened between them, and she watched his face do something extraordinary, a series of things in quick succession, surprise and then something so much larger than surprise that it was its own weather entirely. He sat down. He did this slowly, as though his legs had made an independent decision about what the occasion required. "Susan," he said. "I know," she said. "We are—" He stopped. He looked at her. "I am going to be a father. Yes, she said. He stood up again. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression she would keep for the rest of her life, would take out in her memory and examine in the way you look at something beautiful, carefully, and with gratitude for the fact that it exists. Thank you, he said. You were there too, she said, which was a very Susan Barrett thing to say and made him laugh and made her laugh, and the kitchen held the sound of it, warm and real. Clara, when told, was characteristically contained in her external response and privately over the moon, which was evident to Susan, and which Clara would have denied strenuously. She asked practical questions about timing and the practicalities of adding another person to the household, all of which were good questions and which Harlan answered with equal practicality. And by the end of the conversation, the two of them had devised a fairly comprehensive plan for expanding the second bedroom. Nora's response was to immediately provide a list of names, 16 names, organized apparently by her preference, beginning with a strong endorsement of William if it was a boy. How do you know it will be a boy? Susan asked. I do not, Nora said serenely. I just think William is a very good name. The winter was different that year. The same cold came down from the mountains, the same hard skies, the same months of being closed in and reduced to what was immediately at hand. But the interior of the ranch was changed, charged with the warmth of a house that was full in the way houses can be full, not with objects or noise, but with the ongoing presentness of people who are genuinely there with each other. Susan, in her second trimester, and moving through the winter with the slightly surreal quality that pregnancy imposes on the body's usual certainties, found herself in the unaccustomed position of being cared for and found, to her considerable surprise, that she did not hate it. Harlan was not fussy about it. He did not treat her as fragile, which she would have found unbearable. He was simply attentive in a functional way, the same way he was attentive to anything on the ranch that required more consideration at a given time, matter of fact and thorough, and without ceremony. She caught him once in January, standing in the doorway of what had been the second bedroom, and was now being carefully converted into a nursery, looking at the work he and Clara had done on the walls, the fresh plaster, the small window with its new clear glass. He was just standing there looking at it, and his expression was the expression of a man who has something to protect and knows it and feels the weight of that knowing as a privilege rather than a burden. She went and stood beside him. Alice and I did not have children, he said. There was not time. I had stopped believing it was going to happen. Does it frighten you? She asked. Yes, he said immediately. Good, she said. He looked at her. It frightens me too, she said. At my age. It is different the third time and yet entirely the same. I think if it did not frighten you, it would mean you were not taking it seriously. You are not worried, he said. It was an observation, not a question, and it was not quite right. I am worried, she said. I have decided to also be glad. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they looked at the room together, the fresh walls, the simple preparations for something new. I am going to be good at this, he said. I need you to know I am going to work very hard at being good at this. I know, she said. You already are. The baby came in April. He was born in the early morning, before the sun was fully up, and he was red and furious about his arrival, and Harlan sat in the kitchen through the hours of labor with Clara and Nora, and the town midwife's steady presence. And when Susan called for him at the end of it, he came and sat on the edge of the bed and held his son for the first time with the careful precision of a man handling something he understands to be irreplaceable. The boy was James. Not William, Nora was informed, though they understood she had strong opinions about this. James Robert Dalton, the Robert for Susan's first husband, which had been her idea and which had made Harlan look at her with the particular depth he reserved for the moments when she surprised him. Robert was a good man, he had said when she suggested it. The girls loved him. Yes, she said, and you are also a good man. There is enough room. The spring that James was born was the first spring in many years that Susan Barrett, now Susan Dalton, woke up and did not feel the weight of things before she felt anything else. She woke up and felt the morning, and then heard the baby and felt the warmth beside her, and heard the girls beginning their day in the other room, and lay for a moment in the simple, overwhelming fact of a life that was full, that was genuinely full in all the ways a life can be full, the useful and the necessary and the deeply, freely wanted. She was not naive about any of it. She had been formed by loss and by the long years of carrying things alone, and she did not imagine that choosing to be happy made the difficulty of life smaller. She knew difficulty. She had an intimate acquaintance with it. But she had learned, and this was the thing that Harlan Dalton had given her by leaving her firewood in the dark and respecting her pride enough to work around it. She had learned that self-sufficiency and love were not in opposition, that accepting care did not diminish you, that a person could be strong and also held, could be capable and also known. The town of Millhaven adjusted its understanding of things in the way that small towns do, gradually, and with occasional complaint, but ultimately always catching up to reality. Susan Dalton was still regarded with a certain wariness by the women who had found her pride inconvenient, but the wariness was now mixed with something close to respect, the particular respect a community develops for a person who was right about themselves when the community was wrong. Harlan Dalton became a known quantity, the way people become known quantities when they simply stay in one place and do what they say they will do and treat people fairly over a sufficient period of time. He was not a man of large gestures or loud opinions, and Millhaven, which had initially not known what to do with that quietness, eventually came to understand it as a quality, the quality of a person who did not need to perform his character, because his character was simply what he was. He took on a piece of land adjacent to the Barrett property, 40 acres to the north that had been sitting unused, and he brought in a small herd of cattle that spring and began working them alongside Susan's existing operation, with the methodical building quality of someone who is constructing something meant to last. They worked it together, the expanded ranch, the kind of partnership that some people only theorize about and that requires, in practice, an enormous amount of honesty and flexibility and the willingness to be occasionally wrong. Susan was a better rancher than Harlan in some respects, and Harlan was a better rancher than Susan in others, and they both knew it about each other and operated accordingly, which was the most efficient possible arrangement and also the most satisfying. Clara turned 17 that summer and had begun corresponding with a young man in the next county, a serious-minded farmer's son named Thomas Wick, who had met her at a community gathering, and who had the excellent quality, from Susan's perspective, of making Clara smile in the complicated, involuntary way that meant she was genuinely charmed rather than politely entertained. Harlan's approach to this development was to quietly find out everything there was to know about Thomas Wick's family and reputation, and then to share what he found with Susan in a thorough and even-handed way, and then to leave the matter entirely in her hands. Susan appreciated this enormously. "He seems like a good young man," Harlan said. "He does," Susan said. "Clara has good judgment," Harlan said. "She got it from me," Susan said. "Yes," he said without any qualification. "She did." Nora, who was now 14, had decided that she wanted to become a schoolteacher, which she had announced with the certainty of someone who has identified their calling and intends to pursue it with complete seriousness. This aspiration required better schooling than Millhaven's single-room school could provide, and Susan had spent some weeks worrying about how to arrange it, and it was Harlan who came home one afternoon with information about a women's academy in the city of Helena, 3 hours by train, that had a scholarship program. "She is smart enough to qualify," he said. "I know she is," Susan said. "The scholarship would cover the tuition," he said. "We could manage the board if she stayed with family." "We do not have family in Helena," Susan said. "Alice's family had a branch in Helena," he said. "They were decent people and they have kept in contact with me. I think they would be glad to have Nora stay with them. I think they would consider her something like family," Susan looked at him. "I want to be clear," he said, "that I am not proposing anything without your full consideration. I know it is a large thing to send Nora that far." "She would be safe," Susan said, thinking through it. "She would be well looked after," he said, "and I think she would flourish." He was right, which was both satisfying and slightly irritating, and they talked about it for several evenings and wrote to the people in Helena, and ultimately, with Nora's barely contained excitement providing a fairly clear indication of her own opinion, they decided to pursue the scholarship application. Nora got the scholarship. The afternoon the letter came, she ran from the road to the house at full speed, which she had not done since she was 10, and she burst through the kitchen door waving the letter over her head, and the sound she made when she showed it to them was the sound of a person for whom the future has just come into clear and wonderful focus. James, who was 6 months old and had been asleep in his basket in the corner, woke up and began to contribute his own opinion on the matter in the urgent tones of a person who has been interrupted without being consulted, and the kitchen was briefly, gloriously loud with all of it. That fall, before Nora left for Helena, they had a supper, the 5 of them, that Susan would later identify as one of the specific perfect evenings of her life. Nothing extraordinary happened at it. They ate Susan's good beef stew and fresh bread, and Clara had made a pie that was excellent. And the conversation moved through everything and nothing. The small talk of people who are intimate enough to find small talk easy. And James sat on Harlan's lap and practiced grabbing at his father's shirt buttons, with the concentrated industry of a person for whom button grabbing is the current great project. Susan watched all of it from the head of the table, the lamplight on her daughters' faces and on her husband's and on her son's face, and on the walls of this kitchen that had been the center of so much grief and work and pride and love, and she thought about the cord of firewood that had appeared against her barn wall on a cold October morning 2 years ago. She had stood there in the cold and felt something crack open in her chest. She had not wanted it to crack open. She had maintained her walls with the devoted attention of a person who believes the wall is the thing keeping her safe, and she had been wrong, not about the walls themselves. They had served a purpose. They had held her together through the worst of it, but about their permanence, about whether they were meant to be forever. The walls were not meant to be forever. They were meant to be long enough. She reached across the table and put her hand over Harlan's free hand, the one not occupied with James's button investigation, and he looked up from their son to her, and the look was everything, the whole 2 years of it and everything that came before and everything that was going to come after. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking at you." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. James succeeded in removing a button, which he then immediately attempted to eat, and the moment dissolved into the practical comedy of preventing an infant from swallowing a brass button. And Clara was laughing, and Nora was trying to distract James with a spoon. And the noise and warmth of it filled the kitchen and went out into the evening, and Susan Dalton sat in the middle of her life and was, entirely and without reservation, glad. Nora left for Helena in the 2nd week of September, and arrived safely, and wrote home immediately, with a letter of 11 dense pages describing everything about the city and the academy and the family she was staying with, all of which Harlan read with as much attention as Susan did, and about which he had his own observations and questions, which made Susan love him the way you love a person when they do exactly the right thing without being asked. The years that followed had the texture of real life, which is to say they were not uniformly easy or uniformly anything, but they were built on a foundation that held. The ranch grew steadily under their combined work. Clara married Thomas Wick in the spring of 1885 and went to live on his family's property, which was near enough that she was still present in their lives in a regular and comfortable way, and which was the right distance, close enough to visit and far enough that it was Clara's own life. Susan was a grandmother at 44. Thomas and Clara's son was born in the autumn of 1886 and was named Robert, for the grandfather he would not know, And when Susan held him for the first time in Clara's new house, she felt the past and the present touching each other through the warm weight of him. The continuation of things, the way life insisted on continuing. James grew into himself as children do, with the combination of his father's directness and his mother's iron precision, and somewhere in the mix a humor that was specifically his own, a dry and unexpected funniness that would appear without warning and reduce the table to helpless laughter. He had Harlan's serious gray-brown eyes and Susan's particular way of holding her head when she was thinking, and he had from the beginning a quality of absolute certainty about the world around him, as if he had arrived already knowing that the ground was solid and the people around him were reliable. He was 3 when Harlan took him to see the horses for the first time, standing the boy on the paddock fence and holding him steady while Persimmon, now 12 and still sound, nosed at James's shirt with her soft gray muzzle. James was entirely unafraid, which Harlan reported to Susan with a satisfaction that was so clearly paternal that she had to put her hand over her mouth to contain her smile. "You did not expect him to be afraid," she said. "No," Harlan admitted. "But I am glad he was not. He has never been afraid of anything since the day he was born," Susan said. "He came into the world furious. Fear requires a different temperament." "He has your temperament," Harlan said. "He has yours," she said. "We are both right," he said. "We often are," she said. Nora came home from Helena in the summers and at Christmas, and she was growing into exactly the person she had always been on the verge of being, clear-eyed and warm and certain of her direction, and she had a gift for teaching that was already apparent in the way she worked with James, the patience and the inventiveness of it. She graduated from the academy in the spring of 1887 and came home to Millhaven and secured the position at the expanded schoolhouse that the town had finally gotten around to building. And the fact that she was teaching in the same town where she had grown up seemed right to Susan in a way that circular things sometimes feel right, not as a closing down but as a returning with new knowledge. Nora met a man the following spring. His name was Daniel Carey, and he ran the newspaper office in Millhaven, which had been established in 1885 when the town grew large enough to support one. He was 26 to Nora's 22, and he had an earnest quality and an excellent sense of humor, and an interest in ideas that matched Nora's precisely enough to make their conversations, on the occasions when Susan was present for them, slightly dazzling. She watched them together one Sunday afternoon at her kitchen table, arguing cheerfully about the proper education of children in the new territories, and felt Harlan's quiet attention beside her and leaned slightly into his shoulder. "She has a good one there," he said, low enough that only Susan heard. "She knows how to choose," Susan said. "She learned that somewhere," he said. She pressed her elbow into his ribs and he caught her hand and held it under the table while the conversation over the cake and coffee ran on, and the kitchen was full of the voices of people she loved. And outside the spring evening was lengthening towards summer, and the ranch was sound, and the cattle were doing well, and there was wood enough stacked against the barn to last through 2 winters. There was always wood enough now. Harlan had made that a personal standard, as though the first cord of firewood he had ever left her had set something in motion that he could not stop. She had teased him about it once, years later, sitting on the porch in the evening. "You stacked that first wood in the dark," she said. "You must have spent half the night on it." "I was trying to be useful," he said. "You were trying to not be noticed," she said. He was quiet a moment. "Yes," he said, "I knew if you knew you would fight it." "The town was right about that part of me," she said. "The town was not entirely wrong," he said carefully. "But they thought pride was the problem. It was not the problem. The problem was that nobody understood what the pride was protecting." She looked at him. "What was it protecting?" He looked at her steadily. "The only thing you had left that felt entirely yours," he said, "your ability to manage. If you let that go, if you admitted you needed help, you were afraid you would lose the last thing Robert's death had not taken from you. The accuracy of it sat in the evening air between them. You worked all of that out from watching me through 2 transactions in a hardware store and a dry goods, she said. I am very observant, he said. That is almost annoying, she said. Almost, he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The evening went on going, the way evenings did, the sky changing its colors over the mountains, the horses moving in the paddock, James's voice somewhere around the back of the house, the ordinary music of a life being lived. Harlan, she said. Yes. I am glad you left the wood, she said. He put his arm around her. He did not say anything, because with them the things that were most important were sometimes said in the spaces between words, in the particular quality of a silence held between two people who know each other well enough to fill it without speaking. She understood what that silence held. It held the same thing it had always held since that night in March with the stars overhead and her hand against his jaw. The same thing it had held through every Sunday afternoon, and every winter morning, and every calving season, and every evening at the kitchen table. The same living thing that had grown from whatever it had been at the beginning into the deep and rooted thing it was now. She had been a woman who managed alone. She had been a woman who was too proud to be helped, and the town had been half right about that, and she had been half right about the town, and somewhere in the gap between those two half-rightnesses, a man had left her firewood in the dark and trusted that she would eventually be able to see help without seeing an insult, and she had been able to do that. And here was the result. Here was this evening. Here was this life. She was 50 years old the following spring and felt it as a kind of arrival, the specific arrival of a person who has crossed enough terrain to understand how far they have come. The ranch was prosperous in the modest and real way of working land that is well cared for over time. James, who was 7, had recently begun the serious business of learning to rope under his father's instruction, and the sight of the two of them in the paddock on a Saturday morning was one Susan returned to regularly in her mind, the boy serious and concentrating and Harlan patient and exacting, and the rope going over the fence post again and again until it went right. Nora and Daniel were married that April. Susan and Harlan stood together at the small ceremony, and Susan watched her youngest daughter say her own words at an altar with a joy that was so full it was nearly incandescent. And she felt the same thing she had felt holding Clara's first son, the continuity of it, the way love insisted on passing forward through the generations like some essential thing that could not be kept still. Harlan had his hand at the small of her back throughout the ceremony, the steady warm presence of it, and when Nora and Daniel were pronounced married, and the church filled with the uncomplicated happiness of a small town celebrating its own, Susan turned to her husband and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "I was thinking about a cord of firewood," he said. She laughed. She laughed in the way she had learned to laugh since knowing him, fully and without self-consciousness, the way you laugh when you are with someone in whose company laughter is not a performance. "The best investment you ever made," she said. "No question," he said. He kissed her in the church doorway with the sunlight coming in, and their daughter and son-in-law proceeding past them down the aisle, and James wedged between them, grabbing at the nearest available adult hand. And the people of Millhaven who had once stood in front of Hendrick's store and talked about Susan Barrett's pride filed out around them, with expressions ranging from charmed to resigned to genuinely moved. Mavis Coburn, who was aging with a determination equal to her other qualities, caught Susan's eye as she passed and gave her a nod that contained, Susan thought, an acknowledgement of something, not quite an apology. Mavis was not the apologizing kind, but a recognition. Susan nodded back. The afternoon after the wedding they rode home, the three of them, through the spring countryside that was so particular to Montana in April, the new green of it, the big sky full of light and the mountains still capped with white in the distance. James fell asleep against Harlan's side on the wagon seat before they were halfway home, the specific boneless sleep of children who have expended everything, and Harlan drove with one arm and held the boy steady with the other. Susan sat on his other side and watched the country go by, "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "When I was standing in that barn in October of 1882 looking at my wood pile," she said, "I was frightened, truly frightened. Not about the wood specifically, about everything, about whether I was going to be able to hold this together for another winter, another year." She paused. "I did not tell anyone that. I had not told anyone anything for 2 years." He was looking at the road. "I know," he said. "And then the next morning there was a cord of wood against the barn," she said. "And whoever had done it in the dark, without a witness, without waiting to be thanked, without any of the things that would have made it feel like something I owed." She looked at the side of his face. "I did not know who you were yet, but I knew exactly who had done it, because only someone who understood the specific geometry of that kind of pride would have known to do it that way." He was quiet for a moment. James shifted in his sleep and Harlan adjusted his arm and the horses kept their steady pace. "I did understand it," he said. "I had my own version of it for years, after Alice died. The particular kind of pride that is really just refusing to let anyone see how bad things have gotten, because letting them see it means admitting it to yourself." He glanced at her. "I recognize it because I know what it costs." "It costs everything," she said. "Yes," he said. "And then you pay it anyway because it feels like the only currency you have left." They drove in silence for a moment, the good silence that did not need filling. "You gave me something else to spend," she said. He looked at her, and the look was the same look she had been collecting for 6 years now, the one she would never stop finding remarkable, the one that told her she was seen. "You were always going to be all right," he said. "You just needed to know you did not have to be all right alone." She put her head on his shoulder the way she did in the evenings on the porch, and James slept between them in the afternoon sun, and the ranch came around the last bend in the road, and was there, solid and alive. The barn and the fields and the fence lines and the well with its good insulation, and the house with its extra rooms and its 5 years of accumulated life, and Susan Dalton, who had once stood in the cold and stared at a cord of firewood with something cracking open in her chest. Looked at her home and felt it, full, everything was full. The seasons would keep coming, the winters would keep being hard, the land would keep demanding what the land always demanded, and there would be difficulty, because there was always difficulty. That was the texture of a life lived on real ground. But none of it would be carried alone, and none of it would be faced with the particular weariness of a person who has sealed themselves so thoroughly inside their own self-sufficiency that they have forgotten what warmth feels like from the outside. She knew what it felt like from the outside now. She knew it specifically, in the feel of an arm around her and a hand in hers, and a man's voice across a kitchen table, and the weight of a sleeping child, and the sound of her daughter's laughter, and the long, uninterrupted continuity of a life shared with someone who had first understood her in the dark, in the act of leaving her something she needed without asking for anything at all. The wagon rolled into the yard, and the horses stopped at the hitching post, and Harlan set the brake and they sat for a moment in the afternoon quiet of the ranch before James stirred and woke, and looked around with the slightly affronted expression of a child who has been asleep against his will, and is now required to rejoin the world. "We are home," Harlan told him. James looked at the house and the barn and the paddock with the thoroughness of a person conducting an inspection, and then, apparently satisfied, held up his arms to be lifted down. Harlan got down from the wagon and lifted his son to the ground, and James immediately went in the direction of the horses at a half-run, which was how he went everywhere. Harlan turned and offered Susan his hand from the wagon, which she accepted with the ease of a person for whom the gesture has become entirely natural, entirely usual, entirely part of the daily architecture of her life. She stepped down, and he kept her hand, and they stood in the yard looking at their home. The firewood was stacked properly against the barn. It would last through any winter. She had made sure of that, not because she was afraid anymore, but because she had learned to prepare not from fear but from the simple love of being ready, and there was a difference between those two things that she felt clearly now in a way she had not always been able to. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They went inside together.